what you find out in your life when you're young, and you need to know this, all of you, is that you need to get good at least one thing. So you need to get very good at least one thing. You have to specialize in something. And that was really the point of an apprenticeship, right? Because you subject yourself to a master, and I'll use that term despite its connotations, let's say. You subjected yourself voluntarily to the discipline imposed in a single direction. The philosopher Nietzsche pointed out that nothing of any value could be attained, even on the front of freedom, without first subjecting yourself to intense voluntary discipline. And so he thought of voluntary slavery in some sense as the precondition for freedom. And you can think about that. Imagine that you're trying to learn to play a musical instrument. Or imagine what you had to go through when you learned to read. There's that initial process of skill automation, which is very painstaking and difficult. But once you master it, to pass through that disciplinary structure, then you have freedoms that you wouldn't have had before. Once you learn to read music and to position your hands properly on the piano keyboard and to play the appropriate scales and chords, then you can play music, and you couldn't do that to begin with. And so the subjugation of yourself to a disciplinary structure actually frees you. This is another thing conservatives have to tell young people. And then the other thing you'll note, that you do note as you get older, if you've gone through a disciplinary process or a multitude of them, is that they first narrow you as you specialize. Then as you get deeper and deeper into your specialization, the world broadens out in front of you. And so, for example, when I went off to do my PhD, I studied alcoholism. But in order to study alcohol and its effects on the brain, I had to study neuroscience and neuropsychology. And once I started studying neuroscience and neuropsychology, neuropharmacology for that matter as well, then I had to understand, well, turns out I had to understand, at least to the degree I was capable, the functioning of the entire brain, because alcohol washes the entire brain like water. And so I had to write a thesis, which is a disciplinary process, focused particularly on the genetic predisposition among males with multi-generational family histories of alcoholism to alcohol reward. And that's a very specific topic, but it didn't matter, because as I got deeper and deeper into it, it started to reconnect to the whole world. And so it's extremely useful for you to master something. Pick something, or more than one thing, but start with something. In some sense, it doesn't really matter what it is. It just matters that you do it. And what'll happen is you'll also develop the discipline that goes along with that process of self-mastery. And once you have that discipline instantiated because you subjected yourself voluntarily to a particular goal, you can take that discipline and subject yourself to other goals as a consequence. And so you don't have to worry that if you become a master of one thing, you become a jack of no trades. The greatest people I've met, I knew a great artist in Montreal who was a very good friend of mine. And he was a licensed taxi driver and a licensed carpenter and a licensed boat pilot and a great interior decorator and extremely skilled socially and a great visual artist. He had that all at his fingertips, and that was multiple masters. He had served multiple masters and become a master himself.
It's okay to wander around stupidly before you fix your destination. Now you see that echoed in Exodus, right? Because what happens is that the Egyptians, or the Hebrews, escape a tyranny, which is kind of whatever you do personally and psychologically when you escape from your previous set of stupidly held and ignorant and stubborn axioms. It's like, away from that tyranny. It's like, great, I freed myself from that. Well, then what? Well, you think, well, now I'm on the way. It's, no, you're not. Now you're in the desert, where you wander around stupidly, and worship the wrong things until you finally organize yourself morally again and head in the proper direction. So that's worth knowing too, because you think, well, I got rid of a lot of things, excess baggage that I didn't need in my life, and now everything's okay. It's like, no, it's not. You've got rid of a whole set of scaffolds that were keeping you in place, even though they were pathological. Now you have nothing, and nothing actually turns out to be better than something pathological, but you're still stuck with the problem of nothing. And that's exactly why Exodus is structured the way that it is. It's that you escape from maturity, it's hooray, we're no longer slaves. Yeah, well, now you're nihilistic and lost. It's not necessarily an improvement. But it is it's also useful to know that, because you can also be deluded into the idea that, imagine that you're trying to become enlightened, which might mean to turn all those parts of you on that could be turned on. You think, well, that's just a linear pathway uphill. It's just from one success to another. No, it's not. It's like, here you are and you're not doing too badly, and the first step is a complete bloody catastrophe. It's worse. And then maybe you can pull yourself together and you hit a new plateau, and then that crumbles and shakes, and bang, it's worse again. And so, because part of the reason that people don't become enlightened is because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially, by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then you're basically screwed, because you go ahead on your movement forward and you collapse, and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapsed. It's like, no, that's par for the course. It's not indication that you failed, it's just indication that it's really hard. And that when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearned is probably useful, and unlearning it actually is painful. Let's say if you have to get out of a bad relationship. It's like there isn't any relationship that's 100% bad. And so when you jump out of it, well, maybe you're in better shape, but you're still lonesome and disoriented, and you don't know what your past was, and you don't know what your present is, and you don't know what your future is. That's why people stay with the devil they know instead of looking for the devil they don't know. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful. Okay, so if you were an efficient person, you would have just done that. But you're not. But who cares? You still end up in the same place. And maybe the trip is even more interesting. Who knows? Probably too interesting. Jung. I began to understand that the goal of psychic development, by which he means psychological development or spiritual development, is the self. There's no linear evolution. There's only a circumambulation of the self, a getting closer. It's like you're spiraling into something. Something like that. And the thing that you're spiraling into recedes as you move towards it, and gets more and more sophisticated and well developed as you move towards it, because you're not going to run out of goals, right? No matter how much you have your act together, there's probably, undoubtedly, 30 dimensions along which you could get your act together a lot more. So, and some of those aren't even conceivable to you when you're in your initial uncarved state, let's say. You start the journey toward becoming a master by subjecting yourself to other masters. And that's really what you're supposed to do when you get educated, particularly in the humanities, because that's a apprenticeship with masters. And so you might think, like people often think when they won't discipline their children, that if you constrain your creativity in a single direction, you're going to eradicate your flexibility and your creativity. But you won't. You'll just bring order to your chaos. And once you do that, all that creative potential that you have within you will be much more likely to manifest itself. So it's very useful to seriously discipline yourself voluntarily, especially when you're young. You can find out what constraints you can abide within. You can find out how hard you can push yourself. You can find out how hard you can work. You can find out how productive and generous you can be. And all that's unbelievably useful. And then you can dial it back a bit so it becomes sustainable, But it's good to wear yourself right to the bone if you can while you're young, so you start to understand who you are. And you can't do that without pushing yourself right to the limit. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women, she could ask the damn characters what they represented and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and, you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like, really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and, you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. So the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good. That sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first, well, she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. And she'd kind of go like this, and, you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove, and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know. And I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas often, they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do. Because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart. And no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic?
I've worked in emergency medicine for 11 years, and I've seen a lot of death, yet I'm so afraid of dying. Any advice on how I can be at peace with dying and mortality?
Well, I don't know if anybody's ever really at peace with that. I mean, I think what you can take away, read Socrates' Apology. There's two versions of it. There's Plato's version, and there's is his name? Aristophanes? There's another version. Don't think that's right. Anyways, there's two versions of Socrates' Apology. It's very short. It's only a few pages long. 15 pages or something. Read them both. Why? Well, because Socrates puts forward a very interesting proposition. And I don't know really what to make of it. So I asked my parents once if they could take a drug that would return them to being 18 physically, but they had all the wisdom that they'd accrued over the years. They wouldn't lose that if they would do it. And they didn't say yes right away. And I don't know if they ever did tell me what they had decided, but it was interesting to me that they didn't say no right away either. It was interesting that they had to think about it, because you'd think that if you were offered something approximating immortality and health, you'd take it. And maybe you would, but then here's an alternative proposition, and I don't know. It's not like I'm not trying to maintain myself. If I could extract out an extra decade or an extra 20 years keeping myself healthy, that seems like a good thing. Would I want to live 500 years? Whew, that's a long time, man. 1,000 years? I don't know. It's a long time. But the alternative is, truncated existence with death. And that's also not particularly palatable. And so is there a medicament for mortality? Well, but implicit in Socrates' Apology is the following idea. Imagine you lived your life fully. And that would mean that you said what you had to say when you had to say it. You did what you needed to do when you needed to do it, and you availed yourself of every opportunity that came your way, right? So you'd exhaust yourself in the service of your life, let's say. Maybe by the time you were old, you'd have had enough, and you could just let go. And, you do see this with people, is that, and we kind of know this even when we grieve. Maybe you have a relative who's 95 and they die, and people are sad, but you say, well, they lived a full life, and the fuller the life, the less, in some ways, the less catastrophic the demise appears to be. And so it might be that if you fully exhausted yourself, that your life would be enough. So I know, people, I mentioned this already, people who are old and they look back on their life, they're often sorrowful and regretful for the things they didn't do, the things they left undone and maybe now can't do. You could imagine those of you who've been parents, maybe have grown kids now, you think, well, if you could have children again, would you? And maybe the answer is yes, but another answer is, well, I had kids already. I already did that. And if you did that well, maybe that's enough. We have grandkids now, and that's not exactly the same as having kids. It's kids light, right? And it's wonderful. But you made a joke about that when you were on stage. You said they have all the advantages of grandchildren with none of the disadvantages, and that's a joke. But everybody laughs because everybody gets that, and it's great to have grandchildren. And would we return to our youth and do it again? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, right? Because you just don't have you can't tell what you decide unless that option was actually available to you. And maybe the answer is yes, and maybe the answer is no, because, been there, done that, on to whatever the next thing is. And so I would say, if you're afraid of death, take a look at how you're living and see if you're all in. And maybe if you're all in enough, that's good enough. I think that's right. And I think also, if you're all in and death visits, and it's impending, you could say to yourself, I did everything that I was here to do. At least then you're not going to torture yourself with that as you're facing death. That's something too.
You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. So then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. And that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you. Plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you. And it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on. Because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at. Really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. It's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. The people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. And I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. And what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in Stir Qualinus Inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things, and oh my God, it's like things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it? And so it's low-hanging fruit, man. Because that's the other thing. If there's a lot of things wrong with you, then it's really easy to start fixing it, You got there's so much territory that you can inhabit. I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee. That's good. I mean, the whole nation thing, that's positive. But to have God on your side, that's, you might want that when things get rough. That would be good. And make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Wonderful. That's a good deal. And I will bless them that bless thee. That's good too. And curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That's something. That's something. Wouldn't it be something if you could wake up and your day was composed in part of people thanking you for all the good things you've done in the world? Wouldn't that be good? It's not impossible for that to happen. So Abram departed. Yes, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years when he departed out of Haran. That's old. Now Abraham lives a long time, but this is also part of the story. So he has a wife who can't have children. He has nothing. Obviously, he's been hanging around Dad's shack for a little too long, given that he's 75, right? It's time to get a fire lit underneath him a bit. And so he's not got much going for him, but he still decides to move forward. And I've seen this too, like if you don't have your destiny in hand by your time you're 30, it's rough. You start hurting. And if you don't have your destiny in hand by the time you're 40, then you really start hurting. And 40 is a real fork in the road. The fork in the road, that's always where you meet the devil, by the way. And that's because every time you have to make a decision, the possibility of evil beckons. That's why that is. I had a friend, I've told you a little about him, and he killed himself just after 40. He had had a book published with a very small press. He was quite a good writer, but he could not get himself together, and it hit him too hard at 40. And I'm not saying that it's hopeless at 40. I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying that partly because of these verses, but also partly because of what I've seen in my clinical practice. I've had people come to me who have had very chaotic and ill-spent lives, let's say, who were in that neighborhood of age, and it's true for people who are older as well, who then decided to make a real effort and to try to make where they were better, instead of being bitter about where they weren't, because that's the bitterness that really does you in. It's really not good. It's the opposite of gratitude. It's the manifestation of resentment. It makes you malevolent. It's very, very bad to be bitter. It's hell to be bitter. And if you're 40 and you're not successful, then you have to accept your lot, and you have to start to improve what's right in front of you. And if you do that, it doesn't take very long. It's quite interesting to watch people. Things can be a lot better in 6 months, and they can be way better in 2 years. It's a struggle, uphill struggle, but it's by no means impossible. And I don't know, again, what the limit of that is. I suppose it depends to some degree on the degree of your commitment. But anyway, so it's another indication of the real validity of this story. God isn't setting this up to be easy, right? Abraham's old, and his wife is old too, and more than that, she's barren. How is he going to be the father of nations? How is he going to be successful? Well, the initial departure point is insufficient, radically insufficient. And that's very inspiring, because it means that you can start from where you are.
I often don't very well, and doubt my ability to stand up for myself in discussions and aggressive situations. How do I know when I've incorporated my shadow? Practice makes perfect. One thing you could do is start keeping track of situations like that, where you walk away thinking that you should have said something. And so then I would say, write down the situation, and then think through and write down what you think you should have done. And then, because that's going to help you be sharper on the draw and more ready so write down the situation, write down what you think you should have done. Then sit and imagine the situation as vividly as you can, right? Get the pictures in your head and imagine yourself doing that, and try to get the psychophysiological responses up as well, so that you make it as realistic as possible. And that will actually help you practice. So Edna Foa, who's a very good clinical psychologist, has demonstrated quite clearly that when treating post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, if you get people to sit and imagine being back in the stressful situation, they have to do that voluntarily, and after at least 18 months after the trauma. And she did psychophysiological recording of heart rate and skin conductance and that kind of thing. She showed that the people who showed the highest levels of stress reactivity to the reimagining were the ones who got better fastest and stayed better longest. So you have a situation that you know you haven't mastered. Define the situation repeatedly. Define your proper action repeatedly. Practice implementing that in your imagination, and then start to do that in your real life. And that'll see, if you write down what you should have said, you'll find out what you really want and what you really think. And that'll be your shadow talking. That's the best way to think about it, is that the part of your brain that wishes it would have done something different is the shadow associated with the aggression whose integration would strengthen your character. When Nietzsche announced the death of God, he formulated another proposition. He said that we may have to become gods merely to atone for the sin of deicide. And so he believed that the overman, the superman, would be someone who, through the power of his own will, set his own values. Now, I spent a lot of time reading Carl Jung, in relationship to Nietzsche. Jung, for example, published must be a 1,500-page, 2-volume book on the first third of Thus Spake Zarathustra, and was a very deep Nietzschean scholar, but fell under the influence of Freud. And this turned out to be of cardinal significance, because Freud was one of the first secular thinkers to note that in some unbelievably fundamental sense, we are not masters in our own house. There are sub-personalities within us. There are complexes within us. There are angels and demons within us. That's another way of thinking about it. And they pull us this way and that, sometimes independent of our will and often contrary to our will. And so Freud's conclusion was, it's very difficult for human beings to create their own values because we have an intrinsic nature that's not subject to our arbitrary will. And then Jung took that a step further, and he said, well, there's no doubt that we act out a myth and story, and that in the deepest sense, that has to be a theological story, and that the spirit that guides us has to have a unitary nature, which he did associate with Christ quite explicitly. And it's a vicious rejoinder to the Nietzschean presumption that we can create and impose our own values. For the psychoanalysts, those values, and I would say for the wise clinicians, those values have to be discovered, not self-generated and imposed. Plus, you just don't live long enough to do that. You're just not wise enough to generate a whole system of universally applicable values out of whole cloth in the span of your trivial life.
And if you know you're doing that, then you reduce life to a game. You have created the meaning of life. Well, who is the creator? You? What gives you the right to do that? What gives you the power to do that? You did not create the universe. How can you write the laws of morality any more than you can write the laws of physics?
Well, it's also, people find that shallow. You know, in my clinical work, I saw this time and time again. So if I was dealing with someone who was suffering, you know, maybe they had a tragedy in their own life, a medical tragedy or medical tragedy among members of their family, or maybe they had been subject to some really vicious, malevolent actors and they were despairing, they had to discover the values that would lift them out of that catastrophe. They couldn't impose them. And it's a real search. I think this is probably related to your work on prayer. It's a real search. And one of the things I used to counsel my clients about, and I also built a program called Self-Authoring that helps people do this, and this is associated with that biblical injunction in the New Testament to knock and have the door open and to ask and to receive and to seek and to find, is that you can have a dialogue, an interior dialogue that precedes something like this. And I think it's a prayer, which is, okay, I understand, because I'm reasonably mature, that there is a tragic and malevolent element to life, and it's deep enough to destabilize me and to upset my faith in existence itself. Is there a path that I could walk down that would be so rich and meaningful that I would find the challenge of dealing with the tragedy and malevolence ennobling and worthwhile? And then it's a search. You think, well, what would be of sufficient value to offer that possibility? And people find that they find it in love, they find it in family, they find it in friendship, they find it in sacrificial occupation, let's say, they find it in beauty. But these aren't created values, they're discovered values. And then you bring yourself into alignment with them. As Nietzsche pointed out, I suppose, is that there's some real utility in staring into an abyss. And Nietzsche warned, right, if you stare into an abyss, the abyss might stare into you, and that if you fight with monsters, you risk becoming a monster. And that's an extremely wise caution. But one of the things I've sort of sorted out in relationship to the crucifixion image is that the crucifixion image and the passion story, in some real sense, and I'm speaking psychologically here, not religiously, at least to begin with, is the ultimate abyss, because it brings together all the elements of unfair suffering that might characterize life, or that do characterize life. It brings them together in a single story. And then it makes the claim that if you gaze upon that image with sufficient intensity and duration, and perhaps faith, which you have to have in order to gaze upon it at all, is that what you end up seeing and contemplating is not death and hell, but the resurrection and the overcoming of death and hell. And you know, one of the things clinicians have learned in the last 100 years, perhaps above all else, maybe they learned two things, is that honest dialogue promotes health and redeems. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you face what disturbs you and forces you into paralysis and avoidance and tyranny, if you face that forthrightly and voluntarily, that will ennoble your character and help you grow. And so a lot of what a clinician does is take a fear that someone might have that's paralyzing them, and then break it down into small subsets, sort of like the brick in relationship to the cathedral, and then have people practice voluntary confrontation. And what inevitably happens is not that people get less afraid, but that they become braver and more competent. And so then you might say, if you tied that back into this idea of the evil that besets creation and the notion of human free will, you might say that the universe is constituted such that it's a greater good that evil can exist as a possibility, and that it's a greater good that human beings have free will than that they're compelled slaves. And the downside of that is that we can freely choose evil. And then that accounts for the pervasive evil that characterizes human endeavor and the cosmos in some sense. But that a world without that possibility, because it would involve pure subjugation and no choice and no voluntary assent and no real destiny, a world without that would be a much lesser place. Because one of the things you can say is that it's possible that God left human beings something important to do. I would say, in some sense, by definition, is that the most profound goods are reflected in the structure of the human heart. If people are striving forward, and I mean forward rather than downward, let's say, forward and uphill, they are by definition pursuing something that's a reflection of a transcendent good. It's transcendent because if they already had it, which means it would be imminent, if they already had it, they wouldn't have to pursue it. They posit something outside of themselves as better. And then the ultimate definition of that, in some sense, is the pursuit of the divinely good. And again, I see that as a matter of definition.